Let's start with both of you. Before we go anywhere else, I think the most pressing question at this point is to discuss what the impact of COVID-19 has been on kids and how we believe that might shape the alpha generations. Just what are the learnings? What's the impact and what are the learnings at this point? Josh?
Yeah, and I might actually start with a little anecdote because I didn't know until Ray told me shortly before this session that the alpha generation starts with 2010, people born in 2010. I have a daughter who was born in 2009. I have a daughter who was born in 2011. They were actually bickering a couple of weeks ago about when the dividing line was, and my older daughter's like, I'm in a different generation than you. She's technically correct, but ultimately it doesn't really matter for purposes of the question we're discussing. Just observing it in my own household has been breathtaking. I think kids have gone through a transformation in a way over the last couple of years in which what was already a trajectory towards being digital natives, which is now an overused term, became truly baked in. And kids had to figure things out for themselves in ways that they hadn't before. And the mundane, such as just making themselves meals without burning down the house, but really using digital tools being a key part of it, and having to encounter not just the wonderful things that technology gives us, but all of the risks. And I think that's where we get to man-made disasters and the kinds of challenges that kids, especially being digital natives on the one hand, but not being small adults, being truly different in brain development on the other hand, are going to have to encounter. So that's sort of what I've seen over the last few years.
Ray, do you want to take that on in the first instance?
Sure, happy to. I think the 2010 is an interesting year because it's the same year that the iPad came out. And so you have kids today in this alpha generation that have been exposed to the digital environment their entire life. And I think there are a few aspects of what COVID brought on. First of all, being digital natives, they were quite comfortable, I think, adopting to that style of communication. So I think that's one thing. It also forced them into a new learning environment. And so I know one of the focus areas we're going to be talking about is education. And I think it has tremendous implications for education. And we can address that in future questions if you'd like. And the third thing is, I think it has exposed them through COVID to a lot of things earlier in their life than maybe other generations have been exposed to. And they understand the disease, they understand the conflict, they see what's happened around the world, and they, through their access to media, they've been able to see these things at quite a young age. And I think that's made a change maybe in how they view the world and how they'll address these issues going forward.
So why don't we take on the impact on education then? Why don't you take that on now? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think a few things are happening. The traditional classroom and the way of education dates back hundreds of years, and without really much change. I mean, that's K through 12 education, but it also includes the college education. One of the interesting things to me is what I consider to be, there's edX, and there are some of these online education opportunities that people have taken advantage of over the years. And, you're going to have the youngest programmer talk here in a few minutes. I think what's happened, so we have, for generation after generation, believed that education was the way to improve our lives. And so the parents of, especially the last couple of generations, have almost mandated that kids go to college. Some of those people going to college aren't quite ready. And so because they're not ready, maybe there wasn't as much focus, maybe the degree that they get isn't quite as valuable. And so the value of education as measured by a degree, I think, will be overcome by the abilities and capabilities that people show and demonstrate in the workplace, or through the interview process and entering the workplace. And so I think that's something also that the digital education environment has offered, is an ability to learn at your own speed, to self-learn, because let's face it, many of the alpha generation kids are going to live longer than 100 years. They're going to be living to past 100, so they have to think about lifelong learning. So that's another component of how do you teach yourself, how do you learn, how do you demonstrate that knowledge, as opposed to, I'm not saying degrees will go away, but I do think that colleges are going to have to adapt and adopt new strategies of education.
I agree completely with what Ray just said. I also think that, in a way, the next decade is going to be as compelling as any, because we'll have this generation of kids very comfortable with digital tools, very comfortable with the way the world is moving into more of a hybrid environment, becoming adults, beginning to interact with government, with companies, with the job market, with the healthcare system, with the banking system as adults. And so probably both their expectations about the ability of that system, so to speak, to respond positively to their being ready to engage, as well as some of the dangers that they'll face, some of the risks that they'll face, will be quite profound. And apropos of the reason we're here and the mandates of governments, it will be incumbent on policymakers to think ahead about what that means.
And they are doing that.
Yeah.
So how is government preparing? To your mind, are governments doing a good job? Where are they doing a good job? Where do they need to do better? What is your understanding of how governments are preparing for the alpha generation?
I don't think they're doing much at all, quite honestly. I think they're probably, maybe focused on other issues and other things. We have a lot of problems in the world today, and they are stepping up to some of those things. So I guess indirectly, as governments are dealing with issues like climate change and possibly income disparity around the world, they're dealing with some of the issues that the alpha generation is going to face. But I think they're not stepping up to many of the issues that are going to be paramount. For example, in the US, there's a Social Security system. How will the Social Security system work when you have people living much longer lives, which the Social Security system was never intended to support? There are many other social programs in governments in countries around the world. How are these countries going to adapt their social programs to these people who live so long? And how are they going to put in place education systems that go beyond, think about it, K through 12, mandatory and nothing beyond that? So how do you think about reskilling people? And then we've been talking here about smart cities. What will it mean to have a smart city that has the mobility and the interaction and the support structure that enables this generation alpha as they age to continue to be functional and be additive to society, as opposed to a drain on society that then has to be supported by beta and gamma and the other generations that follow?
On a very micro level, I was just considering the story that I was doing on CNN yesterday, that kids in Ukraine, in the city of Kyiv, were going back to school. And I know it's a mess and it's very tough, and we are continuing to report on, what is going on there, and hope that we are, looking at least a proposal for a solution to what is an absolutely awful situation. But it occurred to me as that announcement came that, had it not been for COVID, that these kids in Ukraine, this alpha generation of children who are going through so much, not just exposed to so many risks and so much of what is on offer, in the world, just online, but they're living through this. On a day-to-day basis. How do you, Josh, imagine platforms like Zoom will change and or adapt with and for this generation?
Yeah. We've had, of course, extraordinary growth during a really challenging time for everybody on the planet. The question you asked, though, Becky, I think is the key question that we're encountering right now, and there are many ways to answer it, but I think at bottom it comes down to having a sense of where the world is going, having a sense of what people's expectations are for where the world is going, whether it's how people work, how people learn, how people get health care, and particularly with this generation, again, understanding those expectations and being ready. So to make it a little bit more concrete, and pulling on the last question a little bit too, I've been having a number of conversations this week with leaders in this region, and I'm actually quite impressed with their level of understanding of the need to prepare for this moment, for exactly the question you asked. From our perspective, it means not knowing that we're not going to have and we hopefully will not have a world where we're all spending all the time at home. People are going to be living hybrid lifestyles. It will mean different things in different places, and the younger generation especially is going to demand flexibility to define that for themselves. So for us, it's a combination of enabling that kind of connectivity from remote locations, equipping office spaces in schools and hospitals with our technology so that people that are physically present can interact with those that aren't in an equal way. And it will mean equipping governments in particular with tools based on our video platform, but going well beyond it into all kinds of different interactions so that they can provide services to this new generation who will be expecting them in a seamless, quick, and in many ways face-to-face, over the screen type of environment.
How do you stay relevant? Yeah, I mean, because you didn't have first mover advantage. There were video platforms before yours, but you had this enormous opportunity during COVID. I have to ask, it's a question I've been asking for a long time, and this is the first opportunity that I've got to actually get somebody to address it. How do you now remain relevant?
I think it's a good question. I think in a way, the relevance piece is the easier piece. The more exciting and exactly, is the competitive piece. Yeah. A lot of companies are getting into this space. People understand we're going to be in a hybrid future, and there are all kinds of smart, innovative people and companies are racing, as are we, to be a part of that and to serve people. So I actually think the relevance question is an easy one, but the competition question is the one that we're working as hard as we can to address favorably.
But you haven't
for
addressed
ourselves.
it.
Well, no, I mean, I think maybe my answer to the last question, I think, addresses it, which is meeting people where they are, meeting countries where they are, meeting policymakers where they are in certain places where you've got, large rural populations, wide levels of income inequality. That means something different. Zoom has to be positioned to connect people remotely, perhaps in a low bandwidth environment. In other places, it may mean equipping, a Dubai or a Singapore or New York City, equipping office buildings with tools. And so the circumstances in each market may be very different. But for us to stay relevant, it's understanding how people want to communicate and becoming a part of that fabric of their lives.
Because I guess that begs the next question. What type of technology will define Generation Alpha?
Yeah, let me see if I can add to the answer that Josh gave and also to the education piece. And I think the word that comes to mind is gamification. Right? Because not only did the Generation Alpha grow up in a digital environment, they love the gaming environment. And studies have shown that education that is not rote memory but is fun is a lot easier, and you actually engage in it and you learn, and so gamification can apply to education. But gamification, I mean, I remember when I first heard the word metaverse, and it's avatars and a virtual world where people will be actually doing things and exchanging money and trying on clothes. I just saw an event the other day that was a runway exhibition of new clothing that was all virtual, right? And people are buying clothes. And so I think getting into that virtual environment through gamification and not just a flat screen.
So let me stop you.
Will help.
What does gamification mean? There will be possibly people in this
audience so
who don't know.
Gamification essentially means learning or conducting activities as though they were a game, right? So
have we accepted that gaming is actually for good? at this stage?
Yeah, I think the answer is probably.
Tell everybody with a 14-year-old.
I think the answer is probably. I think the answer is probably yes. I saw an interesting example of what gaming is to you and what gaming actually is, and it was two pictures. And the first picture of this is what you think of gaming, and it had this guy who hadn't done really anything like taking a shower or for a week, and he's sitting in front of his console and playing a game, right? And then they said, that's what you think of gaming is, and then this is what gaming is, and they showed an auditorium with 10,000 people in who were actually participating in watching people in a game event. And so it is a big thing. Yes, clearly you have to control young people's time so that they don't get completely dominated by the digital environment, and I think Bill Gates said that about his kids, and he probably knows about that. But I think gaming, gamification will play a major role in how we educate people, and in terms of how we communicate. This alpha generation will be very comfortable in a mixed mode environment of communicating, not just on a flat screen, but in a more inclusive environment.
You guys are involved in the industry. Have you, though, still been surprised about how relatively young children were able to adapt, how versatile kids were through COVID, how resilient they were to the online environment, as it were, as opposed to that in-school environment? And I wonder how that shapes policy going forward. You're saying this is going to be a generation that will be incredibly comfortable in an online digital environment.
Incredibly comfortable. In fact, you can see kids using certain devices like an iPad before they can speak.
Yeah.
It's intuitive to them, they figure it out, and they learn very quickly.
Josh?
Yeah, exactly, and it's the primary medium that they use for so many interactions. I mean, the kids have entire relationships over text, and it's completely normal to them. So if you sort of extrapolate from that simple example of what it could mean for the world, and it's not even being comfortable. It's really the instinct for them is to be on platforms, to be using data, to be interacting digitally.
Given that we are from a generation where all of this was relatively unfamiliar, but let's be quite clear. You're right. This is a generation of kids, all of whom will be very, very familiar with devices, whatever those look like, going forward. I'm assuming we're still talking about hardware devices for this generation for the time being. A piece of hardware, but that may change.
That may change, yeah.
That may change going forward. We ought to talk about, and I know that you've both alluded to this, there are risks involved in, or perhaps we should back out and say, are there risks involved? And what sort of support should governments, and indeed the private sector, be providing for kids growing into adults in this generation, in that online, let's call it the metaverse? What are the risks as we see them from our perspective at this point? Because they may not see them as risks, right?
You're
That
right.
may be a generation who simply will be surprised that we believe that there are any risks involved.
This is in some ways the nature of technology. I remember hearing someone speak about the internet, and they said, we embraced the internet. And then about 5 years later, we worried about cybersecurity and privacy and those kind of issues. So I think that's one of the things that comes to mind is, of course, the security aspects and the privacy aspects of living in this total digital environment where everything, even today, people who are avid users of online systems, everything they're doing all the time. And so you can kind of follow every move they make, maybe too much, right? So how do we think about moving into this metaverse environment where governments put in place regulations and laws that protect the individuals from themselves in a way, from exposing their...
We're past the point of no return on metaverse, by the way, on the metaverse, are we?
I think so. Yeah, I think so.
Josh?
Well, as soon as it's defined for me, then maybe I'll be able to form a view on the metaverse. But I will say, to your earlier question, Becky, I mean, it is a core public policy challenge to figure out at least one dimension of the challenges now kids, soon to be young adults, are going to face. And that core challenge has to do with personal data and online safety, which in certain cases run in the same direction, in certain cases run in the other direction. What I am observing is that kids are very free in sharing their personal data online in ways that it's hard to imagine they would do, and certainly adults would do, in the analog human-to-human environment. At the same time, there are a lot of privacy tools that are popping up that in of themselves are great things, but that can nevertheless be exploited by child predators, fraudsters, other kinds of bad actors in ways that kind of present a countervailing risk.
You can imagine a world where the access to somebody else's private data ends up not being risky, and that will be the way that we redesign the importance of our private data. The last point you made, though, is not something that we will reimagine ever.
Right.
The idea that there is a risk from predatory behavior. That will never go away, and so that must be something that is super important to all policymakers. Guys, I'm going to just ask you in sort of 60 seconds just to provide a position as we go forward. The session title today is A Future for Learning and Talent. So your 60-second take, if you will, as we close out this panel. What does that mean to you, and what's your message? The future of learning and talent.
I think the future of learning and talent is one that is highly flexible, that ideally does involve face-to-face contact, but that understands that true learning and true talent proliferation happens across borders, it happens at great distances, it happens in different cultural milieus, and so it's critical that governments and companies as well develop the tools and the mindset to, again, meet this younger generation where it is.
Ray.
I think this is a great opportunity to transform our learning and educational systems. We have a generation who are technology savvy and who can be engaged in this process. We also, as we talked about, have a generation that's going to live a long time, and so we have to instill lifelong learning throughout this process. And then finally, I talked about how education itself will change from a degree solely representing someone's knowledge and abilities to the knowledge and abilities transforming and changing throughout their life, and them demonstrating that in different ways.
With that, I thank you very much indeed. Super